This was to be the most foolish act of venting anger. A Dutch boy named Dirk was using his camera to capture the scene of the German defeat and retreat. This provoked intense disgust in a German officer who was already feeling suppressed. He turned around to scold Dirk and smashed the camera viciously onto the ground without explanation.
Wo sind denn eure Befreier, hä? Wo sind die denn? Die haben immer noch das Kommando.
Looking at the shattered camera, the anger that instantly ignited in Dirk's heart almost consumed him. At that precise moment, a German truck, honking madly, came speeding towards them out of control. Furious, Dirk angrily picked up a stone from the ground and threw it violently at the truck. However, the flying stone accurately smashed through the windshield and hit the driver right in the forehead. The out-of-control truck immediately rushed into the crowd, crushing several soldiers to death. Witnessing the tragedy, Dirk finally woke up as if from a dream, realizing he had caused a catastrophic disaster, and stood there frozen for a moment. It wasn't until the German officer from before turned back to identify him. Dirk suddenly pushed away the soldiers beside him and began a desperate escape. The threat of death stimulated his potential, and he thrillingly leaped over a towering fence. By the time a large group of soldiers arrived, Dirk had vanished from their field of vision. Originally filled with joy, his sister Tointje watched this heart-wrenching scene with horror. It turned out that on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces successfully landed in Normandy and advanced triumphantly, approaching the Scheldt River in the Netherlands. Therefore, the city of Vlissingen on the riverbank was flooded with a large number of retreating German troops. Although the Dutch people, ruled by German high-pressure tactics for 4 years, dared not show it on their faces, their behavior could hardly conceal the joy of impending liberation. Tointje, knowing that the Allies had fought their way to the opposite bank of the river, was equally jubilant. Working at the city hall, she had no mind for official business. Facing the mayor, who was panic-stricken and preparing to flee after working for the Germans, Tointje seemed to find the courage to retort to his verbal slips.
Voor zieke Duitsers en zieke Zeeuwen.
However, this beautiful longing for liberation was completely shattered by her brother's momentary impulse. Returning home, Tointje hurriedly hid Dirk in a secret room. Facing his sister's concern, Dirk mocked her and their father as cowards, his face filled with pride as if he had just accomplished a heroic feat. Misfortunes followed one after another. Early in the morning a few days later, the originally retreating German troops returned with high morale. They could absolutely not give up Walcheren Island. Once lost, it would become the Allies' largest rear supply base. Subsequently, Tointje heard a conversation between the Germans and the mayor at City Hall. They were hunting for the culprit who caused that fatal car accident. The list of suspects filled an entire page.
Het is een trouwbare man. Vanochtend vroeg 3 onschuldigen. En ze worden geëxecuteerd. Als degene die het gedaan heeft, zegt niemand.
To avoid implicating innocent people, Tointje hurriedly went home to discuss with Dirk, proposing to tell the truth to their father. As a highly respected doctor in a German hospital, their father might be able to use his connections to hide Dirk. But the stubborn Dirk flatly believed that their father, who worked for the German army, was completely unreliable. After pondering for a moment, Dirk suddenly thought that Jana could help. This surprised Tointje. Jana was her best friend whom she had grown up with. Why did her brother think she could settle such a major matter? In Jana's bakery, Tointje bluntly made the request that Dirk needed a hiding place. Hearing this, Jana was shocked, and her hands kneading the dough became obviously flustered.
Ik ken veel mensen. Wie dan? Hoezo weet ik niet dat je mensen kent?
Soms is het beter om niet te veel te weten, Teun.
Hoezo weet Dirk dan wel dat je mensen kent?
Their conversation was interrupted by German soldiers coming in to buy bread, but Tointje seemed to have faintly sensed the unknown identities of her brother and best friend. The camera cuts to the Soviet front line in Narva. At this time, the German army was showing signs of total collapse. Having just finished burying the mines, this Dutch soldier named Staveren was horrified to discover that Soviet soldiers were close at hand. He ran back to the temporary trench in a panic, preparing to put up a futile, last resistance with his comrades. Just then, he found his childhood friend Lucas, pale-faced, paralyzed in the trench, having completely lost the will to fight. Before he could comfort him, Soviet T-34 tanks, coordinated with infantry, charged into the position. German soldiers fired in panic to intercept them, busy engaging the enemy. Stavron suddenly looked back and was shocked to see Lucas walking out of the trench like a walking corpse. Before he could pull away to drag Lucas back, the T-34 tank had already reached the front of the trench. Just as the German troops instantly scattered and fled, a shell suddenly exploded near Stavron. After regaining consciousness, he found Lucas missing and had to hurriedly hide in the nearest cover. Continuing his search, he was shocked to find Lucas cowering behind a truck outside the cover. At this moment, Lucas's pupils were dilated. He was gasping for air and had completely lost consciousness. A German soldier tried to fire a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket launcher, but was precisely killed in the next second. To save Lucas, Stavron immediately picked up the rocket launcher, shouldered it, and aimed. The moment he pulled the trigger, that T-34 exploded and detonated. However, before he could manage to pull Lucas back, Lucas stood up and walked straight toward the Soviet side. When Stavron woke up again, he was already in a German rear hospital. He had been wounded by a shell explosion during the battle and had fainted. The subsequent counterattacking troops saved him. Here, a neurotic lieutenant who had lost both legs and was muttering to himself revealed to him the tragic encounters of Jews in concentration camps. He witnessed how the SS tortured and executed resistance fighters, and also witnessed how officers forced soldiers to charge with guns at their backs on the battlefield. All of this completely shook his initial belief in joining the German army. But in that environment, he felt deeply powerless. In the end, this lieutenant managed to use connections to secure a clerical position for Stavron in the Dutch city of Vlissingen, then shot himself amidst the torture of war trauma and remorse. The view shifts to another protagonist, William. He is a British glider pilot and a veritable second-generation rich kid. Despite his father's strong opposition, he resolutely and secretly participated in the Allies' massive Operation Market Garden. William, participating in an operation of such scale for the first time, was incredibly excited. However, bad luck followed. When the glider group flew over Walcheren Island, German anti-aircraft guns suddenly wove a fierce net of fire. Several planes in the formation were unfortunately hit and fell. The glider William was piloting was one of them. A shell instantly tore through the nose of the glider, and the captain, Turner, was unfortunately seriously wounded and lost the ability to control the craft. Soldiers in the cabin checked and found that the glider's right wing had also been cut in half by artillery fire. Turner made a prompt decision, ordering William to unhook from the towing mother plane. At the critical moment, the release mechanism was jammed tight. Helpless, William had to ask Hank in the back seat to pull the release lever while he struggled to turn the rudder to perform a rolling maneuver, forcibly breaking the hook. After the crash landing, 5 people, including William, survived, but at this time, they were already in a German-controlled zone. Now, William and his comrades faced 2 choices. One was to surrender upon seeing the German army. The second was to find a way to escape or rejoin their unit. Originally, William thought the others would cover each other like him until they escaped and found the main force. However, upon waking up, he was shocked to find that 2 of them had taken all the food, maps, and other supplies and quietly disappeared. Previously, they viewed the seriously wounded Turner as a burden, while William stubbornly refused to abandon him. Helpless, William and Hank had to leave Turner in a shelter and go out to find a boat, attempting to cross the Scheldt to find the Allies. Just as the 2 returned to the shelter empty-handed, William suddenly noticed a rubber dinghy parked at the door. Instantly sensing something was wrong, the 2 hurriedly retreated to cover. Quietly passing through the back door and sneaking into the house, they heard Turner's heart-wrenching screams. 2 German soldiers were torturing the immobilized man. At this moment, a German soldier walked out of the room. He was completely unaware of William and Hank. Seeing this, William decisively raised his gun and subdued him. However, just as he signaled the German soldier to enter the basement, the other party suddenly grabbed the muzzle of his gun and they rolled into the water together. Immediately, they wrestled together, engaging in a life-and-death struggle. The shouts of the fight immediately alerted the other German soldier in the room, but he dared not come out, only shouting his teammate's name in terror. Finally, William, who was about to be defeated, used his last bit of strength to grab a bottle and smashed it ruthlessly on the German soldier's head. The German soldier, taking a heavy blow, instantly lost the ability to resist, and they thrillingly resolved the crisis. Walking out of the basement, the furious William told Hank to guard the prisoner while he walked straight to the room where Turner was. Inside the room, the timid German soldier used Turner as a shield, emotionally raising his gun and ordering William to drop his weapon. Turner signaled William to shoot with an unusually firm look in his eyes. In the standoff, the two men raising their guns became increasingly emotional, and danger was imminent. Accidentally killing Turner left William filled with grief and indignation. Unable to let it go, he walked straight to the basement. Despite Hank's strenuous efforts to dissuade him, William, raising his gun, coldly pulled the trigger. After burying Turner, William pushed the German rubber dinghy, ready to rush toward the direction of the smoke to seek survival. However, at this moment, Hank refused to go with him. Looking panicked, he repeated over and over that the world was too crazy. Immediately, Hank decisively took his rifle out of the rubber dinghy, indicating he would no longer look for the troops to fight. Seeing Hank's unusually firm eyes, William had to stop persuading him and rode away alone. A few days later, William successfully encountered a Canadian unit. He did not reveal his identity as a rich heir and subsequently joined the ranks. Meanwhile, on Tointje's side, the SS officer Berghoff suddenly arrived at Tointje's home. With a gloomy face, he and his subordinate sharply scanned everything in the house. The solidifying atmosphere was suffocating. Dr. Visser, returning home from work, was deeply surprised by the officer's presence. When Berghoff ordered that Dirk must be taken to headquarters to report the next day, Dr. Visser suddenly realized the severity of the situation. The next day, Dr. Visser, having learned the whole story, went to headquarters with Tointje to plead for Dirk. He hoped Berghoff would consider his treatment of the German wounded and show leniency to Dirk, even if it meant sentencing him to life imprisonment, because he firmly believed that the day of the Netherlands' liberation was not far off, and Dirk would be released then. At the same time, he also hoped to release the innocent children. However, throughout the conversation, Berghoff's fingers impatiently tapped the table, his eyes filled with mockery, and his lips curled into a cold, emotionless smile.
Laten we gaan. Die man speelt een spelletje met je.
Was sagen Sie?
Dass sein Sperrdienst gleich anfängt.
Was hat sie gesagt?
Dass ihr Vater zur Arbeit muss?
Nein, davor.
Sie hat Angst, dass sie ein Spiel mit ihm spielt.
Hearing this, Berghoff did not get angry again, but instead praised Dr. Visser for his many contributions to the German army. Because of Stavron's unreserved translation, Tointje couldn't help but look back at Stavron, who was serving as a clerk. In the end, Berghoff appeared to fully agree to Dr. Visser's requests in the office. After returning home, Dr. Visser personally put Dirk on the German truck, naively believing the other party would keep their promise. But Tointje knew very well in her heart that her brother might never return. She then discovered a large number of photos taken by Dirk in a hidden compartment in the wall. From the photos of German defense armaments, it was not difficult to judge that both Dirk and Jana belonged to the Resistance Intelligence Network. In order to save Dirk, Tointje found Jana again.
Kun je deze? Dirk is opgepakt.
Geef maar aan mij die foto's. Ik geef ze wel
Aan je vrienden.
Ja. Het spijt me, maar die foto's zijn heel belangrijk.
Je kan die foto's krijgen als jullie Dirk bevrijden.
Teun. Je moet me ze geven. Ik ga wel met ze praten.
Ik wil mee.
Dat kan niet. Vanavond om 8 uur. Hier.
That night, Tointje met that friend in Jana's secret room. He was also the resistance leader Pim, responsible for underground intelligence in Vlissingen. He got straight to the point, asking Tointje to find a way to get a tidal map of the Scheldt River channel. The map accurately depicted the Slowdam Causeway and the surrounding wetland conditions. Working at the city hall, Tointje had the opportunity to access these. The next day, using her position, Tointje successfully obtained the river channel map. She immediately handed the map to Jana after work and left in a hurry. However, a sudden change occurred. In the headquarters basement, Staveren witnessed the brutal interrogation of Dirk by the SS with his own eyes. As early as in the hospital, through the narration of the suicide lieutenant and his own experiences, Staveren had long detested Nazi atrocities. His belief when joining the German training camp was extremely shallow to begin with. Harboring a shred of kindness and guilt, he found Tointje in front of the city hall and heavily informed her that Dirk, unable to withstand the torture, had confessed many names of the resistance army, and he would likely not escape death. However, just then, Berghoff's adjutant happened to pass by and saw Staveren meeting with Tointje. Soon, the resistance members who were betrayed were all arrested. Pim, meanwhile, with the cooperation of others, took advantage of the Germans' inattention and chose to escape because he still had an extremely important piece of intelligence that had not yet been sent out. On the other side, Staveren, back at headquarters, was told by Berghoff that he no longer had to serve as a clerk. He was sent directly to the front line. This also indirectly pronounced Staveren's death sentence. Tointje sorrowfully informed her father of the news that her brother was about to be executed. Dr. Visser risked death to beg to see Berghoff, fighting for a last chance. However, Berghoff merely glanced coldly back at the grief-stricken Dr. Visser and ruthlessly closed the door, as if proudly showing off his treacherous deception. The gentleman's disguise of the past was completely torn to shreds, revealing only the essence of a devil. On the execution ground, Staveren was forced to participate in the execution of the resistance fighters. He showed no sign of hesitation, and when the order to fire was given, he pulled the trigger without pause. At this time, he might have become numb, unable to change their fate, nor unable to change his own outcome of rushing to the front line. On the other side, the anxious Tointje came to Jana's bakery. Pim, having been shot while escaping, was unable to continue the mission. Based on the tidal map Tointje stole and the photos of German defenses taken by Dirk, he formulated a plan. Use the high tide to smuggle across the Scheldt River and raid the German garrison at the Slowdam Causeway. He emphasized the extreme importance of the plan to Tointje and Jana. If the map could not be delivered to the Canadian army on the other side in time, the Allies would have to attack the Slowdam Causeway from the front, and the Canadian army would suffer immeasurable, heavy casualties. Jana initially hesitated timidly. However, in order to inherit her brother's will, Tointje resolutely took the map and nodded firmly to Pim. At this time, at the end of the Slowdam Causeway, the Germans had built strong fortifications. A powerful 88mm flak anti-aircraft gun was strikingly erected at the bridgehead. The icy water of the Scheldt slapped against the reeds. Tointje and Jana had been squatting breathlessly in the cold, wet marsh for several hours. When the pale light of the last flare faded into the darkness, they immediately struggled to push the hidden small boat. Just as the small boat was about to leave the shore, the Germans suddenly blew up the dam. The soaring flames of the explosion illuminated the river surface like daylight. The German soldiers responsible for surface patrols discovered the figures by the riverbank almost simultaneously. At the critical moment, Jana threw herself onto the boat first and reached out her hand back to Tointje. Just as she wanted to pull Tointje up, she was suddenly hit in the body by a bullet. Tointje, eyes splitting with rage, smashed the tidal map soaked in hope and blood into Jana's arms. Immediately, she used all her strength to push the small boat violently into the dark river channel. At dawn, the next day, the Canadian commander, who had not received the intelligence, issued the order for a forced attack in anxiety. The plan could not be delayed any longer. They were not allowed to wait any longer. Immediately, William and other commandos of more than 100 men resolutely rushed onto the narrow Slowdam Causeway. When they ran to the center of the river dam, the German deadly fire net ruthlessly covered them. At first, it was the spot killing by German snipers, and when they got closer, the hissing sound of MG-42 machine guns became increasingly dense. The terrifying shells fired flat from the 88mm anti-aircraft gun stirred up a storm of blood and flesh in the team. Instantly, the charging soldiers fell one after another like wheat being harvested. The causeway with no cover instantly turned into a corridor of death. In the end, the commando team paid an extremely heavy price, but failed to even step 1 foot out of the blasted breach. The German side, however, suffered no casualties, and the fortress stood immovable. Seeing this scene, Stavron couldn't help but gasp and collapsed softly to the ground. When the few remaining surviving commandos stumbled back to the camp, Canadian soldiers patrolling the riverbank discovered the drifting small boat. Inside was Jana, covered in blood and barely clinging to life. The map guarded with life was finally delivered. The commander made a prompt decision and formulated a new battle plan based on the map. One part would feign an attack on the front of the dam to pin down the main German force. The other part would take advantage of the dark night and high tide to secretly row through the complex river channels, to circle behind the Germans and launch a fatal raid. Attacked from front and rear, the German defense line collapsed in an instant, and the soldiers were terrified and fled in all directions. Amidst the chaos, William, pursuing the routed troops through the reeds, came face to face with Stavron, who was fleeing for his life. Stavron raised his gun to point at William first, gaining the advantage. However, there was no killing intent in the soldier's eyes. He had long seen through the absurdity and failure of this war. He slowly lowered the muzzle of his gun, giving up this easily obtainable chance of survival, simply waiting calmly for the other's judgment. Seeing this, William quickly aimed his rifle at Stavron, but seeing the exhaustion and relief in Stavron's eyes, he did not pull the trigger. Instead, he silently poked his chest with the muzzle, signaling him to turn around and leave. Stavron looked deeply at William, said nothing, and silently disappeared into the smoke-filled reeds. The fall of the Slodum Causeway was like pushing over dominoes. The German troops in Vlissingen fell into complete panic and fled in chaos. Meanwhile, Tointje, squatting alone in a prison cell, fell into extreme panic. A German officer, eager to escape, suddenly saw Tointje locked in the room during his hasty retreat. He kicked the door open murderously. At that moment, Stavron, who had come looking for food, caught sight of the scene inside. The moment he saw clearly that it was Tointje, he followed in with a knife, his eyes determined. Just at the critical moment when the officer pulled his gun to shoot, Stavron, with a fierce look in his eyes, stabbed the knife violently into the officer's stomach. However, the officer, who was not fatally wounded, fired 2 shots in succession the moment he fell, hitting Stavron in the body. The severe pain stimulated Stavron's final ferocity. He pounced on the officer like a beast, snatched the gun from his hand, and swung the gun butt frantically, smashing it down on that head. At this moment, Stavron seemed to want to smash all the suffering, sin, and remorse that this war had imposed on him completely to pieces. Blood stained the floor red. Tointje flusteredly tried to stop the bleeding wound on Stavron's chest. Stavron's unfocused eyes struggled to focus on Tointje's face. Tears mixed with bloody water slid down. His lips moved, seeming to want to say that sorry, which was suppressed at the bottom of his heart and weighed 1,000 pounds. Sorry for failing to save Dirk. Sorry that he was the one who personally pulled the trigger on the execution ground to end Dirk's life. But in the end, there was only a faint breath at the corner of his mouth that was almost inaudible. However, deep in his completely dimmed eyes, a flash of relief strangely passed. At least he did this last thing right. Finally, the Canadian Army completely liberated the city of Vlissingen and fully controlled the vital Walcheren Island. The estuary of the Scheldt River was finally open to the Allied supply convoys. However, the price of victory was shocking. According to post-war statistics, in this tragic Battle of Walcheren Causeway, 3,231 Allied soldiers, 4,250 German soldiers, and 2,283 innocent civilians lost their lives forever.